So a year ago, Shadow of the Erdtree was released, and I was incredibly excited to take on the new challenges and explore the new world. So much so that I had spent the better part of a year preparing different characters by gathering items and leveling up so that I could complete several different challenge runs of the DLC. I even had an alt account with a maxed out roster of characters, just in case I exceeded what I wanted to do within one account's worth of characters. But unfortunately, as many of you know, I was not the biggest fan of Shadow of the Erdtree, to say the least. Shadow was nothing if not disappointing to me, and I take no pleasure in saying that, obviously. When it first released, I believe I only played twice throughout the entire DLC, one for my initial no-hit of every boss, and one, I believe, on a New Game Plus of that same character, just in hopes that I was wrong about the content, and maybe it was better than I first thought. And after that point, I began one challenge run that I thought would be the best chance possible to get the most out of the content. A challenge run that I consider to be the most fun of any other in Souls. A challenge run that only really works in a couple of Souls games based on how the challenge run works. That run being the Metyr challenge, or in Dark Souls 3, the only other game that it really works in, a boss run challenge, where every time you beat a boss, you have to become that boss. Now this works really well in DS3 specifically, and is, I believe, a challenge that a lot of people have ran, not just something I've come up with. Because in DS3, there is one specific item that you use to upgrade all boss weapons, the Titanite Scale, and there's a finite amount you can get in the game. Which means to survive the run, you basically have to limit yourself on certain boss fights with a low damage unupgraded weapon, specifically choosing the bosses that you're good at in order to save the higher upgrades for the bosses that you're going to struggle on. I really like this challenge run, for one, because it lets you play with a bunch of different weapons, something that most challenge runs don't really have you doing. In fact, most runs in general don't have you doing that. So it pushes you outside of your comfort zone while also challenging you to meet the expectation of the run, while also having you design a run where you meet specific matchups of bosses that work well in your favor. And that's where the Metyr version of this run in Elden Ring really shines, because Elden Ring gives you a ton of freedom in the order at which you can approach bosses. And so it's a really fun, interesting challenge that I thought would be perfect for Shadow of the Erdtree, because Shadow has like 10 remembrance bosses. There's a ton of them, which in my mind made me think that there would be that much more potential for mixing up the run and finding interesting matchups. Unfortunately, a lot of my complaints about Shadow of the Erdtree kind of come to fruition in this run as well. For instance, every single DLC fight is essentially near max level difficulty. So it's very difficult to save the stones that you might want to bank for harder fights when just about every fight in the DLC is one of those harder fights. Because of the artificial Scadutree fragment method of progression throughout the DLC, you're basically expected to have a max level weapon throughout the entirety of the DLC. You see, the way that I go about trying to mimic that interesting resource management feel of the DS3 version of this challenge is by restricting myself so that I can't buy any somber stones from bell-bearing sources, which means you can only essentially use EG and potentially other vendors to obtain stones, and he only has a handful of 3s and 4s, but infinite 1s and 2s. So at bare minimum, I'm going into any fight with at least a +2 weapon. But that really made this challenge a lot more difficult than the original version I ran in the base game, because it means that every difficult fight in the DLC is potentially that much more difficult if I'm not going to level a weapon, or my resources are that much more constrained in order to level my weapon for the more difficult fights. And again, that's where the disjointed nature of Shadow of the Erdtree kind of shows its ugly head, because I really wanted to find some kind of synergy between the base game and Shadow of the Erdtree in this run. And so another rule I set for myself arbitrarily for this run was that after reaching the DLC, every single fight that I did, I would alternate between the base game and the DLC, so that my matchups had to be a base game boss versus a DLC boss, and then vice versa. And yeah, that sounds like a pretty cool concept in theory, but it really does not play out all that interesting. Unfortunately, it's this very staggered, disjointed mess of struggling super hard through a DLC boss and then using a low-level weapon on a base game boss and kind of crushing them based on, for one, having a lot of experience with the base game, and for two, most of the moves of the bosses in the base game kind of just work. You don't have to do some arbitrary weird shit to make it actually function like it should. Okay, I'm getting a little bitter about the DLC. Okay, let's get back to the concept of the video here. You see, I started this challenge run a bit after the Shadow of the Erdtree released, a week or so, in hopes that it would bring some levity to the DLC that I didn't have before. But I did not make it far before I gave up on this run, because I just didn't want to play. I didn't want to have to struggle through the DLC bosses that I just wasn't that much of a fan of. And I didn't want to have to design my entire run so that way I would have an answer to Radahn's broken move, being that this was pre-patch Radahn when he was still broken. My only thoughts to address this were maybe to defeat the Draconic Tree Sentinel, and then use the shield method of dealing with his move with Draconic's pretty powerful shield, I imagine. But even this it didn't feel good. That's not how I wanted to play the game. And it kind of was this stain on the entire run that just made me anxious about the future. And so before I got too far into the run, I gave up. I didn't want to play anymore. And instead I focused my efforts on creating my initial, very critical review of Shadow of the Erdtree titled, "There's Something Wrong with Shadow of the Erdtree," which I very much stand by to this day for the most part. And so after a year, I finally decided to return to this run for two reasons. The first of which was just to finish the run. They patched Radahn, and after giving the DLC a break, I was a lot less mentally fatigued by it, so I was ready to approach it again. And for two, I want to use this video as sort of a retrospective about the DLC a year later, and to kind of see if I stand by a lot of the opinions I had about it originally. So this is going to be Shadow of the Erdtree, 1 year later. What do I think of it? And as well as that, a hopefully fun little challenge run that I don't know if a lot of people know about or play this way, so if I do inspire you to do a run of your own, I definitely recommend it, at least for the base game. Very fun challenge run. So I began the run by first beating the Grafted Scion and becoming it, which you don't necessarily have to do. You could always just lose to it and then play as the Wretch for your first boss, but I figured I might as well beat him and then kick this run off with the first swap. From there, you do this standard Elden Ring run across the entire map to gather resources and materials. I also off-screen beat Morgott because he doesn't drop anything, you can't really turn into him. He gives you your first talisman unlock, which is hugely helpful early on. From there, I set my sights on unlocking the DLC as soon as possible, which meant having my first two fights be Radahn and Mohg, which is kind of a difficult thing to do from the start, but is very doable the way that Elden Ring is set up. I gathered the Dectus medallions, hit the Altus Plateau to unlock Radahn's fight, and then did a very simple, easy, cheesy way of beating him by mostly utilizing Torrent to avoid most of his moves, besides one large combo that I find it easiest to deal damage on. Becoming Radahn, however, is the first real challenge of this run, because his armor is very heavy and his weapons are very heavy, and we don't really have the souls necessary to level up our endurance stat high enough to wield them effectively, alongside also getting the stat requirements for his weapon. And so one thing that really helped this run along is that after defeating Radahn, we begin to do Vair's Quest, which will allow Mohg to be our second and final early game mandatory boss fight to reach the capital and all that, unlocking a larger part of the map, which will be very useful for allowing us to have as many potential matchups possible once we start getting into the DLC fights, which will need to be carefully thought about for the proper matchups in order to succeed in them. I used the offline variant of Vair's Quest, which you don't even need to beat in order to unlock the next steps, which is perfect for our current fat-rolling underleveled state. And from there we can finish Vair's Quest and get a very early game access to Mohgwyn Palace, including the very valuable rune farm, which will be super useful to us to meet the stat requirements of various weapons without having to restat at Rennala every single time. Of course, this makes this a bit more of a grind, but that's kind of what we're expecting when the challenge run itself has so many restrictions. And after a good bit of leveling and gathering of resources in Mohgwyn, we're left to fight Mohg as Radahn. A very difficult fight that I decided to level my weapon up to +5 in order to do. Even though I feel like I'm pretty good at the Mohg fight, the damage just was pretty bad. Would have been an insanely long battle. And after beating Mohg and becoming him, I got to do my favorite aspect of the DLC, the absolutely enjoyable, super fun, gather 1,000 pieces of bark aspect of the DLC experience, which left me with a couple ideas about how I would approach my first boss within the DLC. And ultimately I landed on a somewhat sketchy concept for my first matchup. You see, I wanted the 5 Scadutree fragments that are locked behind Commander Gaius's fight. And I had seen that Mohg's spear is actually capable of cheesing Gaius, which I am certainly not above doing. I hate the Gaius fight. I think it's trash. And this came with a series of incredibly frustrating problems. Even though I was cheesing him, I didn't have the resources to finish him off. I had to level up the spear several times, otherwise I'd run out of FP and flasks, or he would do a specific move that would clip through the cheese, or he would just find his way around through the obstacle and then kill me on the other side with his fucked up dash move. Overall, a miserable experience, but I was glad to get it out of the way and to gather the extra Scadutree fragments. And that's the first point I want to touch on in hindsight of the DLC. A lot of people claim that all of my complaints about the DLC basically apply to Elden Ring's base game as well, which, listen, I'm fine with hearing you out on that point if you give examples, but just saying that, it feels super dismissive of my argument for no reason. And one of the things people did give examples of is how the Scadutree fragment grind is essentially the same as Elden Ring's giant original map, having a myriad of upgrade materials, weapons, physic tiers, spells, anything to collect across the giant map, which basically you're always going to start every playthrough by gathering enough that you can have a base level of your build, or by gathering a shitload and absolutely crushing the early game if that's what you're interested in. And the thing that really bothers me is how people will make that argument that the Scadutree fragments are the same, but they're not going to acknowledge the fact that I'm not saying that it's not a similar procedure. The difference is, and this difference comes at a huge cost if you ask me, is that Elden Ring's base world is immersive, very much so. If you want all of the items that you'll need, you have to go into specific environments to find those weapons or spells or whatever it may be that were placed in specific areas because they fit that area of the world. For example, my original no-hit, I liked using the Bloodhound's Fang, which meant going to the Ever jail that the Bloodhound was trapped in and killing him, which dropped his weapon, obviously a very appropriate drop for the enemy. But there's also very important other things you might need, such as Flame Grant Me Strength, an incredibly powerful spell, and a flame spell that is found nearby a Redmane castle, obviously practitioners of flame. It'll also be useful to you to pick up a bunch of Trina lilies to potentially use to sleep the Godskins later on. And so you have to go to various areas of the map where Trina lilies grow excessively. Specifically near that Albinuric village, there's a ton of them. I could go on, but basically everything in the game are these little bits and pieces that build up the world around them to create an immersive experience. And you gathering them is an acknowledgement that you know a lot about this world and where everything is. And by the time you have your entire full build, you essentially represent the character that went on that entire experience to gather all those resources and items. When you compare that to Shadow of the Erdtree, you already start as the fully leveled character that you reached at the end game of the original base game. And so there's basically no immersive value in gathering a bunch of one single item across the whole map. You're just collecting bark at that point. It's an Easter egg hunt. It really doesn't have any value other than wasting your time. The way I look at it is like this. Elden Ring is like you're a chef creating, instead of a dish, a build. And so you've got to go to the store and pick up a bunch of items. And some of those items might be more expensive or dangerous to get. Some of those items might be hidden. You might have to ask someone to go get it for you, or have them cut a specific portion of meat. Your trip to this metaphorical grocery store is representative of the dish that you're trying to make. And the better you are at traversing the store, the better off you'll be once you return home and begin cooking or killing bosses. On the flip side, the Scadutree bark is essentially going to the store and being like, yeah, I need 25 of this item, and the manager telling you, yeah, that's at 25 different locations at the store. good luck. Oh, and also there's a big drop of them behind an asshole with a boar who will fucking dash you down 1,000 times. Anyway, I stand behind it. I think the world of Shadow of the Erdtree is flat as fuck and boring as fuck, and the Scadutree fragments are just not enough to be worth going through it all again. I really wish there was just an option to collect them all automatically. Or say like a standalone version of Shadow of the Erdtree where you start as a level 1 and all of the challenges are reworked to be appropriate to the level that you could approach them. All of the items are appropriate of the areas you would see them in, making it an actual journey and experience and not just generic collection minigame plus a boss rush. Anyway, that was all just to fill some time while I showed off some gaius footage of me cheesing and to get the Scadutree fragment rant out of the way. After this point, I turn into Commander Gaius, which is a huge bonus in power because Gaius's weapon is the only remembrance weapon that levels up with regular smithing stones, and one of the few regular smithing stones weapons that we'll be using in this run, which means I can essentially max it out. I believe I got it to max level, including the stones that I found inside the DLC itself. From there, I used this powerful weapon to crush the entirety of the capital. I defeated the first Draconic Tree Sentinel, which I could have turned into at a later point after defeating the second version and gaining the armor, but I chose to skip it for some reason. I then defeated the Ghost of Godfrey in a rather one-sided battle, and used this weapon to take on Morgott, in a rare first try for me. I generally play with low health in most of my playthroughs, and in my opinion, Morgott is one of the most difficult bosses to no-hit. That's kind of just a convoluted way of acknowledging that Morgott is one of the hardest bosses in the game when adjusted for the fact that he's in the mid-game. He's one of the last bosses that you can really over-prepare for and crush super easily, and his weakness to blood loss and frostbite really opens him up to take some significant damage, and opens up the player to really flex on him if that's what they wish to do. But taking all of that aside, I think from a technical level, he's one of the most well-designed and complex bosses in all of Elden Ring. It's because of that I consider him my favorite, even though he doesn't have really jumpable moves. I think that's the one big thing he's missing. After beating Morgott, we become him, and then have to decide which of the bosses we'll be taking his weapon into, which is a more complicated decision than it might seem at face value. Morgott's weapon is pretty good against most bosses. Having a consistent, reliable blood loss is obviously very valuable, especially so against the tankier bosses in the DLC. But with a run like this, the meta is established that you have to think multiple steps ahead. And so it's more than just who am I going to fight, but who am I going to fight and then turn into and fight as that boss. And knowing that I wanted to make progress in the base game, I knew that my next boss after the DLC fight, just ahead of me, would be the Fire Giant, which would then open up Plisig-Sax and Maliketh as potential options farther down the road. And with Fire Giant as my next target, I wanted something that would deal high damage despite large health. And there's nothing I can think of that's better at doing that than Scarlet Rot, except maybe Black Flame, but still. And so my plans for the matchup would be that I would take the blood loss dealing weapon to Romina, and then subsequently use her weapon on the Fire Giant. Unfortunately, this was the last fight that I beat before I gave up, and I think that's kind of a telling situation. I wasn't stuck on any fight when I decided not to play anymore. I had finished Romina in a pretty difficult long fight. I just really didn't want to play anymore. There's been plenty of other challenge runs that I've given up on because the difficulty just didn't seem worth the accomplishment. But this was very much something different. I didn't give up just because I didn't want to play as Romina against the Fire Giant. I gave up because I knew I would then have to play as the Fire Giant against something else in the DLC, and onward and onward, back and forth, eventually culminating in a fight with promised consort Radahn, a fight that, even now patched, still kind of just makes me depressed to think about. So this was the last fight that I did last year, I believe with a +6 Morgott's Cursed Sword against Romina. And all I really have to say in hindsight about Romina is that she really just lacks the presence in this world that you would expect from a fight as seemingly important as this. Like, to prepare for this video, I watched a bunch of Vachiaviccia lore videos that I had skipped out on because I just wasn't interested in Shadow of the Erdtree. Kind of made me sick to my stomach to think about. All very good lore videos, by the way. I would definitely recommend them. And in those videos, it was explained that Romina was a victim of Messmer's crusade, which destroyed her, I believe, horn-sent temple which in her despair, she happened upon an artifact within the destroyed temple, which was the weapon that she uses in her boss fight, which corrupted her into this form that she is now. And so I can't really say that she is all that important, but she kind of should be, and that's the problem. In any other base game remembrance fight within Elden Ring, this would be the pinnacle moment at the end of a long legacy dungeon, filled to the brim with environmental storytelling, a mini-boss reflective of the main boss at the end, a distinct aesthetic theme, and obviously, as everyone's complained before, cutscenes that give us some frame of reference as to why the boss is here, what she's doing, her values, purposes, or even just emotional state, literally anything. In comparison, for example, when we first find Godric inside of Stormveil Castle, he's attempting to court the dead dragon into grafting onto himself, which is shortly after revisited in his Phase 2, showing both his insecurity and motivations for power, where he desperately grasps on to any amount of strength he can. And this is a fight that's the first demigod. He's not even important or powerful, but he has a powerful presence within the world, and he's built up as a character through visual design, cutscenes, voice lines, and through the fact that Morgott is actively attempting to protect him to prevent the Tarnished from gaining access to his Great Rune. A smart decision, it's the best Great Rune in the game. And all of this lacking from the Romina fight is really just such a shame. She's not a character. She's just a boss fight. And she's a good boss fight. I like her, actually. I just wish that she had an entire legacy dungeon with a mini-boss that's essentially an acolyte of her, a smaller version of her, or maybe just a giant insect, a pet perhaps, really anything. It's truly unfortunate that she's just here chilling in her boss room when we get here and leaves no sort of impact by the time you're done. Arbitrary, contrived roadblock is about all she amounts to. So 1 year later, I returned to this challenge in an effort to make this video, and it continued within a fight with Romina versus Fire Giant, which is a pretty straightforward fight that I decided to do with somewhat less than appropriate damage, even though an extended Fire Giant fight basically means you're going to be dealing with some of the weirder quirks of a fight like this. A fight like this being a giant fiery monster stomping around and sending pyromancies at you, which is essentially the same base template as the walking fire baskets in the DLC. And so I'll use this as a moment to talk about them. It's kind of crazy to me that they exist at all and anyone thought they were a good idea when Fire Giant is already in the base game. And Fire Giant is basically just a more complex and interesting version of the fire basket fights. But for whatever reasons, the fire baskets were designed with incredibly high healths considering. It can take a very long time to bring them down, and often they require multiple times bringing them down. It's kind of absurd when they're just even more simple versions of a boss fight that most people don't like. I've only met one person ever who actually enjoys the Fire Giant fight. Shout out to Darth Geber. I do, however, see the need for the fire baskets. They essentially work as a combination of the mausoleums in the base game and the Erdtree avatars, both being a giant set piece that fills the world with more movement and life, while also being a challenge to overcome, which will reward you with physic tears. I think that's largely where these things went wrong. You could argue that the mausoleums themselves are also a fight, and that they also give a reward. But the reason the mausoleums don't become a problem is because that fight is very easy and that reward is very optional. It's not something really most people would go out of their way for. And so they fill their role as this giant set piece adding life to the world in an exceptionally graceful way that I don't think anyone would really criticize or bother to even speak upon in most instances. They're hardly ever brought up at all, and I think most often they're just looked at as a cool part of the environment, and that's it. The reason the fire baskets are so obnoxious is because they have things that you definitely will want at some point. The physic tears are a core part of Elden Ring that help you build towards a more powerful build. You're going to want them at some point, which means you're going to at some point have to tackle the fire basket minigame of whacking their legs over and over again while jumping, or the basketball game with the specific pot. They're just not that fun, and I think most people would agree with me on that. Which is why it's such a shame that the DLC didn't mirror the overworld that much closer by having the Scadutree avatar fill the role of the base game's Erdtree avatars, which are both an appropriate challenge to tackle and also offer an appropriate reward in the form of the physic tears. Luckily within this video I can relate these two concepts chronologically, because my next boss matchup was Fire Giant versus Sunflower, which I think worked out pretty well. I believe the Sunflower is weak to fire, I can't imagine it wouldn't be, and I really needed to get this garbage weapon out of the way on something doable. The Scadutree avatar really is a good fight, and I'm surprised to even say that. It kind of snuck up on me how good it is, because it's just so forgettable. I honestly can't even remember how critical I was of this fight within my original video, so I guess I'll just have to rewatch my video to confirm. Just kidding, you think I watch my garbage content? Are you shitting me? It is one obscure fight that doesn't really offer you anything of value other than its remembrance. There's no reason to come down to this area and no reason to fight this fight other than enjoying it. And so I almost forgot that it existed and skipped it, probably until later when I looked up bosses I may have forgotten. Honestly, I might have forgotten one in this whole run. I don't know. Luckily, I got Gaius out of the way earlier because definitely would have forgotten him had he not been a priority, all for the sake of the bark fragments. But that's the thing I tried to point out a lot in my original video, is that a lot of the problems of the Shadow of the Erdtree content isn't due to the fact that it's bad, it's just improperly used. This Sunflower fight would add exponentially more value to the DLC if it was placed multiple points throughout the world, filling out an otherwise boring, bland world where almost all of the world field bosses you'll find are repeats from the base game, or reskins, or fire baskets. Again, this is just to point out that the world of Shadow of the Erdtree is not worth exploring. You're not going to find anything new just about anywhere outside of the single instances of Remembrance fights or Legacy dungeons, and that is a tragedy. I would also like to clarify when I said that the world of Shadow of the Erdtree is flat and boring, I mean that from a content perspective. Obviously, the world looks very cool and some of the traversal methods are very interesting. It's just the content that sucks. But that could have easily been remedied if many of these DLC Remembrance fights were instead mini-bosses that proliferated the world. Again, I feel like I said that a lot in the original video, but most poignantly, the Sunflower being here instead of replacing many of the garbage fire basket fights is such a missed opportunity. Not only would this fight be better if you could have easier access to it at multiple points, but there could be a level of progression to it, with earlier game ones having less abilities, hopefully notably lacking the triple explosion laser beam attack that's kind of excessive in the final phase of the Sunflower, with subsequent reuses of the Sunflower across the world in deeper areas of the map having more and more abilities. It'd be cool if hunting down each of them collectively culminated into obtaining the Remembrance of the Sunflower. Kind of like how in the DS2 DLC, hitting all of the idols with a smelter wedge will eventually get you the full Bride of Ash boss soul. Anyway, I think the failure to reuse content appropriately is what really sinks this DLC. You get reuses in the most pointless points of the game that don't really matter, such as all of the fire baskets, which only have a handful of good rewards and most are skippable, or another Deathrite bird for no reason. And then the content we actually came and paid for is locked behind single moments where you beat them once and then have to play through the entire game again, collect the Scadutree fragments again, or New Game Plus, in order to be able to rematch with them. I just think it's a huge waste. And the Sunflower is one of the worst cases of this. I think highlighted by the fact that I forgot it was a good fight. It's just not really worth caring about. And that's a shame. It's a valuable asset that's just going to waste here. I remember the first time that this boss was ever revealed, it was within the day one release day trailer for Shadow of the Erdtree. It was such a cool looking boss, and I was so excited to get to it. So excited to understand its purpose in this world, to see if it has greater lore, to see if it would be a field boss that would replace something like a dragon fight or the wicker baskets. And I barely even remember fighting it on my first few playthroughs. It was just one of those not important side fights that, again, like Romina, doesn't seem to have much lore associated with it at all. I don't think any character even acknowledges its existence, and its placement here in the world is just being nearby the Scadutree, and that's it. This boss is absolutely screaming to be reused, from the design of the boss itself having a respawn feature in its boss fight, which almost implies that there was an initial concept that this would respawn itself in the overworld somewhere else, instead of just dying and respawning here multiple times. And it just really sucks that this is such a good asset that I have to sit here complaining about, because its usage is the really important issue. And when it's completely wasted here, then the fact that it's a good fight hardly matters. Like, I already thought that Mohg was kind of a difficult fight to fight again. And the same thing about Malenia. I think they're both fun, enjoyable fights that I like having experience with, but knowing just how much effort it takes to get to them, it's kind of off-putting. And they're important demigod characters that mean a lot to the lore, they mean a lot in the world, they're powerful. And now we're faced with a random tree that came to life that is thematically tied to trees in the overworld base game that we've fought 1,000 times before, existing within the class of tree avatar-like creatures. But in order to fight this fight again, you have to beat Mohg first, which is already an obscure kind of endgame fight, and then get to the DLC, and then level up your Scadutree level, and then find this fight. It absolutely highlights just how obscure this boss is when it becomes so forgettable. And I feel like I'm repeating a lot of what I already said in my original video, and I apologize for that. I understand that it's maybe grating to listen to me bitch about the same shit for a year straight, but I am building towards something, so stay tuned. Hopefully the concept of this being a mimic tier challenge run carries the rest of the video while I recap a bunch of complaints I've already talked about. Anyway, back to the challenge run. The Fire Giant's Whip was actually a pretty good tool to use on this fight here. The damage wasn't even lacking despite it being a +2 weapon on an endgame DLC fight, but I really couldn't flex on him with any of the Fire Giant's bigger abilities, like the Ash of War. Far too long to actually use effectively, and wasn't really dealing that much damage compared to regular attacks. And I also had to switch away from the weapon. Being a whip, it couldn't get criticals during the respawning sections of the tree. And so to avoid it respawning with full health, I had to get the crits with a punch. If there was one big criticism I have of the Scadutree avatar, it's definitely his final form explosive laser triple attack. Like I said, a little excessive, but it is a pretty cool spectacle, and once you get it down, it's not that big of a deal, and would make for a very cool end game of the DLC final form of a reused mini-boss, field boss variant of the Scadutree avatar. Much like how Ringleader Electo, the Black Knife Assassin boss in the Everjail in the Moonlight Altar, has access to a projectile, a jumping destined death attack, a bunch of attacks that make it clear that this is the final form of the Black Knives, the most powerful version. And I hope FromSoft doesn't underestimate just how powerful that notion is, the level of progression you feel when there are less powerful versions of an enemy early on that build to a more powerful version later. It gives a lot of character towards an enemy that otherwise just would be a copy and paste. It is a really fine line to try to balance that distinction between just copy and pasting for the sake of it being a lazy reuse that fills out content, compared to the template that Elden Ring has that works pretty well, where things build on themselves until a point where mini-bosses kind of just feel like full bosses with slightly less health. Anyway, after this fight, I was tasked with turning into the Sunflower, and this left me with a couple options on how to approach this transition. The obvious way would be just to grab the Sunflower Hammer from its remembrance and then beat the shit out of a boss with the Sunflower's head. But I figured I might as well go a little wackier with it and obtain the infamous Thorns spell from the DLC, which technically isn't even part of the remembrance. It's just a separate drop in the world, but whatever. I was LARPing more than actually just following the rules of the challenge. And LARPing kind of is the rules of the challenge anyway, so my goal was to take the Thorn spell, which I assumed was very powerful based on a bunch of content I saw last year that I did not stay up to date with. And I figured a powerful spell would be a perfect matchup against the Godskin duo, which were preventing my progression towards Maliketh and Placidusax. However, I don't know if this spell got nerfed into absolute obscurity. I don't know if it's only a spell that you have to use at super endgame levels where you have 99 arcane and whatever else. This spell was so garbage. This was probably the worst matchup I had in the entire run, even despite being a ranged option on the Godskins. And that was largely due to the fact that every time you cast this spell, you chip off a little bit of your own health, as well as using FP. And on an endurance match like the Godskins, I really didn't have that much margin for error in between the amount of healing items I would need and FP I would need and successful attacks that I needed to land. And this spell can land between 1 and 3 projectiles on any enemy, so it's not even about just landing the attack, but landing as much as possible, while keeping in mind that every blood loss status effect is going to be harder to trigger than the last. This took me far too long, and I probably should have just eaten my losses and changed up my strategy, bought the hammer. But I was committed and eventually went through with it, subverting all of the wacky quirks of the Godskin duo, such as the big guy rolling over pillars, the skinny guy throwing a fireball at you while you're trying to dodge the rolling attack, and whatever else comes with this pretty terrible boss fight, which I had to do almost perfectly in order to stand a chance at actually beating the fight. On top of the resource management that comes with using spells, with this spell in particular, my health also was a resource, and so being hit by the Godskins at all was the equivalent of draining my ammunition. So yeah, this was a terrible fight, but eventually I made it through, and I could have easily skipped this fight as a swap. You don't necessarily have to turn into the Godskins, they're not really a remembrance, and you have to collect a bunch of other gear to become one or the other. But I think it's kind of fun to include them, so I transition here into a conglomeration of multiple of the Godskins' fits and weapons, and leveled their spellcasting item as well as gathering their spells, which was ultimately for nothing. I really thought that the next matchup I would do would take advantage of the fact that Black Flame deals a percentage of damage, which would have been perfect against the tanky Bayle fight. Unfortunately, the Black Flame just wasn't effective enough to be more powerful than just a min-maxed thrusting attack from the Godskin Stitcher. This weapon proved to be pretty powerful against Bayle, and the thing I had forgotten about my original playthrough is that I got to Bayle very early and had very few Scadutree blessings than I probably should have when approaching one of the most endgame bosses in the DLC. And so, having gathered many more this time, this fight went a lot smoother than I thought it would, and I eventually managed to no-hit this boss, which proved to be one of the most fun fights that I did. Bayle is a remarkably well-done dragon fight, and one of the few that actively manages to keep you on your toes for an extended period, trading blows back and forth over and over for a long time. And yes, his Phase 2 definitely leans more into the event-style, cinematic, spectacle-style moves you would typically see from a dragon. In between those moments, you're going to be doing a ton of precise dodges, with careful consideration of your positioning. But all that aside, ignoring all of the rightful glazing I want to do of a good fight, it still must be acknowledged that the camera issues on Bayle are some of the worst we've seen in so long, to a point where you're not even really paying attention to the visual information in front of you at times during certain combos. You just know the timing and dodge accordingly. This entire DLC, as I've said, has had some pretty bad camera issues that I think are impossible to ignore to an extent. Radahn and Bayle are some of the worst offenders, but Metyr is also pretty bad. Rellana has her moments, and the Dancing Lion doesn't seem to have a big enough arena, which all lead to some pretty massive issues. But Bayle kind of exists in that same realm that Godfrey does, where his moves aren't necessarily telegraphed so well. Specifically, the Horaloo grab moves don't really seem to have a moment of impact that you would notice on a first playthrough or early on, or if you haven't played him in a while. It kind of just looks like he's moving his hands, and then the grab is triggered as soon as the hitbox spawns. And the only way to combat that is to be hit by the move enough, have enough practice that you know when to dodge. And Bayle exists like that, specifically within a positioning issue. The hitbox of his mouth attacking you for a bite is kind of too small. I don't really know what you could do to affect that, except maybe have a lightning AoE that accompanies each attack. Obviously not lingering, that shit sucks, but just to make it so that he's attacking you from a further range and still a threat from a further range, so that way his head doesn't push through where your camera would ordinarily be, flipping you around in circles. And would that be a good fix? I don't know, you'd have to implement it and see. But without a fix at hand, you're constantly underneath his attacking head and have to, through pure knowledge and experience, understand what possible moves could come next, and then use, say, like audio information to figure out what you're going to do next. The most specific example is a combo which either ends with a giant lightning slam or a fire breath attack. The fire breath unfortunately being best to dodge at close range, meaning you're likely just going to camp underneath his chin while your camera does fucking backflips. I will repeat myself again and say that his straight fire attack is definitely too chunky for what it is. And again, I would point out this is due to the fact that fire in this game follows physics. It tries to track against the ground, and if the ground is not perfectly even, there will be fluctuations, which result in unavoidable damage, specifically on his pretty fucked up straight fire attack, which is best avoided by sprint jumping away. Once again, a situation in the DLC where your only option is to try to yeet yourself as far as possible from the actual fight. But that being said, I do think that Bayle could be a nearly perfect fight if you were to adjust him accordingly. With some small changes to the camera design and the fire design, he would hands down be the greatest dragon fight that FromSoft has ever created. And probably still is, even despite those failings. I would say maybe Metyr is better, but that's specifically because Metyr accounts for the fact that you're going to be fighting him and offers you openings to attack his head, which kind of breaks your immersion with him. Like, it's a little weird, he's just sitting there giving you an opening, but at the same time, from a gameplay perspective, it's fair to the player, that's the point. It's kind of better than throwing the dragon's head at you 1,000 times at 1,000 miles an hour and putting you in the blender dimension. Now, the interesting thing about becoming Bayle is that after obtaining one of the dragon forms, you'll then have to actually use one of Bayle's spells. Or you could find some other way to role-play the character by using some other dragon-themed weapon, but I chose to go straight forward with it and use Bayle's spell, specifically his lightning stab spell, which for one meant grinding a shitload to reach that arcane requirement, and then also pairing that against a boss that would actually be easy enough for the matchup to be viable. And of the only easy fights I had left, I thought Rennala would be the best matchup. A fight that I had been saving for the end game of this run so that I could meet the stat requirements for her 70 intelligence spells. Unfortunately, it was still kind of a difficult fight to find the openings to land this spell, which has a pretty insane windup, but does deal pretty good damage. And even despite that, this fight ended up being kind of a stressful thing. In fact, I only barely managed to beat it, having a trade at the end, and I think that was due to the fact that the lightning stake dealt an aftershock of damage due to the water in her phase 2 arena. After that, I used the respec tool at Rennala in order to obtain the 70 intelligence required for her staff and moon spell. I also gathered Azure Comet because I figured I would be able to use the unique aspect of her fight having summons in it as a distraction to set up the Azure Comet cheese build. Unfortunately, that very much did not go as planned against the matchup that I had set up for this fight, which would be a matchup of sisters, Rennala versus Rellana. And so I ended up just fighting her as normal, although with a magic build that would mostly consist of backpedaling while spamming spells, a playstyle that I was very much sick of at this point after having done the Godskin duo with the Scadutree build. And maybe it's cheating, but I did end up using Glintstone Ice Crag as my main spell. For one, because it's good, and for two, because I didn't have Comet on me and didn't really want to go find it. So I don't know, light me up in the comments for being a bitch if you want, for crutching on the Frostbite status effect. That being said, I did attempt to utilize some amount of Rennala's real build in the form of her moon spell, which I did not even realize until this point because I had never used it, debuffs the enemies it hits by increasing their magic damage taken for a time. And so I led the fight with one, and then also attempted to use a moon spell on her moon spell in order to jump over one of her moons, which I unfortunately did on the first instead of the third, so she was effectively immune, I believe, to the damage I dealt to her, and didn't take the debuff. Unfortunate, but whatever. Now, as far as criticism with this fight in its place in the DLC, my stance hasn't really changed much from my original video. I do think this enemy, this asset, would certainly work better as a mini-boss, coming down to a variety of mostly nitpicks, but again, no cutscene, no ambience, no place in this world, and an asset that amounts to a very cool, good boss fight that's just sitting waiting for you in this room, leaving no impression by the time you're done. And again, I'd like to point out that this is what I see to be a waste of a good asset. I would much rather fight 10 smaller versions of this fight in increasing difficulty based on the position they're in the game than one hard one that I just get over and then leave and don't really think about for a while. Like, just picture how much more powerful the Carian faction would feel if this asset was instead their version of an elite enemy knight. If this asset was supposed to be a group of female Carian warriors that are attempting, if retconned, to have a visual look that's representative of their leader, Rellana, including the hair, which isn't her real hair, it's part of her helmet, and I believe is a lock of hair that Rennala gave to her. And so you could say that these elite knights are trying to mimic that with a lock of hair of their own that just represents their allegiance to Rellana. And in my head, all you would have to do is take this base template for a knight and soup it up a bit more and tune down the original version to make a distinction between Rellana and this elite knight. For example, if you took away all of the fire aspects for the mini-boss version and then integrated those fire aspects into a visually more unique version of this asset to make it the full Rellana fight, and then integrated the fire aspects gradually as she became more and more distressed by losing the fight. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the fire aspects of Rellana's character all come down to her obsession with messmer, and I assume it's a mastery of flame that she's using as sort of a connection to him. And so in my head, a revamped, better version of this fight would have her initially using her own skills to try to protect Messmer from an invader in his land, and then gradually over time, that obsession becomes a desperation to prove her worth against an enemy, and therefore prove her worth to Messmer, which erupts from her as a fiery passion, slowly overtaking her as the fight goes, becoming a spectrum of initially using mostly magic and sword attacks, and then eventually using more flame AoEs until that passion itself overcomes her, with a final animation of that flame overtaking her and burning her to death from within. You could have her armor slowly become more and more molten as the fight goes on, essentially becoming like a visual representation of her health bar. And this is all just shit I'm kind of like coming up with off the top of my head, just to add any personality to an asset that doesn't have any. As I pointed out in my original video, the Crucible Knights are basically the same thing as Rennala, a powerful knight that represents a faction and uses an assortment of that faction's spells and abilities, some of which can be very bombastic and powerful. And again, it's all the same shit, I'm just repeating myself, I guess. Because this DLC is really lacking those extra layers that show they went the extra mile to make this a character and not just an asset. And that's really fucking unfortunate. It's not just the cutscene that makes this fight not as powerful as it should be. There's a lot going on here that fails, even despite the technical excellence of the fight itself. Again, just kind of unfortunate and a huge waste of potential. So I became Rellana and used this as an opportunity to make progress towards Malenia by tackling Commander O'Neill and using her really fun and interesting weapon to take that on by giving myself bigger openings on situations where I wouldn't be able to deal damage with her ranged attacks. That was probably the most fun aspect of this challenge, is that I got to use a lot of the boss weapons that I would have ordinarily ignored. And so I then became Commander O'Neill and realized I would be fat rolling unless I used his dual wield prosthetic limb weapon, which I used to pretty easily crush the Dancing Lion. The Dancing Lion I'm not a big fan of. I think the fight kind of fucking sucks. But this fight does one thing that's kind of closer to what I would want from the DLC than a lot of the other fights do. And that's that this fight is essentially the sloppy early game fight you would expect from Souls content. No one's really praising Vort for being a good fight, especially in his phase 2. But he is easy enough and early game enough that you're not really going to worry about that. If you need to overpower him, you can just overpower him. And the Dancing Lion is almost that, if you account for all the Scadutree fragments and the various ways you can flex on him with status effects. But unfortunately, I find him to just be too endgame to be this sloppy. The awkward way that his body deals damage and the added AoEs are really not that fun to deal with. But I do see the potential value they could have in just being a sloppy, early game difficult fight. Considering this is most likely the first boss fight that players would see, it makes sense that it's here. And like I've been saying with a lot of these lesser DLC fights that would have worked better as mini-bosses, this fight is a mini-boss, and that mini-boss is a better fight than the actual fight with the Dancing Lion. It has more character, it has a better arena, it's just better overall. And the funny thing about this fight being essentially an early game sloppy fight just like Godric is that this fight is just like Godric in that there is a copy and paste of that asset in the world, despite it being a remembrance fight. And while I do criticize that for being lazy, sloppy game development, it's just kind of fitting that these two fights parallel each other that closely. It just kind of, to me, feels like this was the scraps of potentially a plan for this DLC to originally have been a sequel that I sometimes speculate might have happened, but unfortunately I just don't enjoy this fight that much, and making it that much harder to just skip is kind of a detriment if you ask me. Anyway, becoming the lion is easy enough. He drops his head and then we can use our previously leveled sword lance that we got from Commander Gaius to apply his Ash of War onto it, which is the only source of damage you can get from the Dancing Lion's remembrance. While this is a straightforward way to fight, I did want a fight that I was pretty well versed with, considering I would only be using this Ash of War for damage. And one of the fights that I'm best at in this game is Maliketh, so I began to head there and did a pretty uneventful fight with him. The Ash of War makes for just too big of an opening for a lot of the openings that I would ordinarily use on Maliketh Phase 1, but Phase 2 is basically the same fight as I would normally fight with him, and the added frostbite damage was nice, on top of a fully leveled weapon, made for a pretty easy fight. From there, I made a pretty bad matchup. I took on Maliketh's gear, and then decided to take on Midra. And this is because I had now unlocked one of the fights that I had been dreading, as I do in every run. I fucking cannot stand Gideon in the slightest. His fucking triple ring attack has been so brutal for a low health player from day one. His infinite mana, his infinite stamina, it's just absurd. Which is why I take every opportunity I can to cheese him, which was my goal with Midra's weapon, but that meant defeating Midra with a Maliketh sword that was extremely underleveled, but I figured I could get through if I just eked out enough big hits from his Ash of War. This proved to be pretty difficult, and I actually ended up trading on this fight as well. I will say, while I've got Midra on the mind, I do stand by that this asset itself, the boss fight part of this fight, really would work better as a mini-boss. And one thing I would definitely change from my original video if I had the chance was to point out that the joke I made where I called Midra Midra was mostly a joke. I would probably tone down how harsh I was on him. People seem to really like this fight, and again, like I say with most of the fights that I think would work better as mini-bosses, I would say this fight certainly qualifies. It's not about the fight being bad, it's about the fight being underwhelming and the asset ultimately being underutilized for what it is, and failing to live up to its potential. Even accounting for the fact that this guy has a cutscene and some pretty extensive lore, and voice lines, and his own castle, the fight itself is just pretty bland. It's a headless, personality-less avatar of frenzy, which goes as far as to call itself the Lord of Frenzied Flame, when that is so clearly just an imitation of what we did to become that same Lord of Frenzied Flame. We had to become Elden Lord for it to take place, whereas this guy just rips his head off. It's kind of crazy that there would even be a comparison between the two. Like, I get that he was tortured, but the only thing we have to go on to describe that is the fact that he's got a sword through his body. And that's not exactly like a rare thing in Elden Ring to have an enemy that's mutilated like that. I mean, fuck, we can do it ourselves with the Seppuku Ash of War, and we walk it off like it's nothing. It really is nothing. It's like, what, a tenth of your health bar? Anyway, Like I said, I'm not trying to be too harsh on Midra. I know people really like him. But it just feels to me that it would make a better comparison, not to us as the player, but if redone, the fight would work much better if he was instead an analogy for Radahn. If Midra was a way more imposing figure that could stand up to the likes of Radahn visually, then you could integrate a Phase 2 into him, where the source of his frenzied power comes pouring out of his body, just like the Elden Beast did in Radagon's fight, and then we could proceed to fight a frenzy beast of some sort of greater avatar of the frenzy, representative of the three fingers in some way. Because when it comes down to it, the visual design of Midra just really isn't screaming important figure or lord of anything. Even Vike has a way more distinct, frenzied aesthetic, and he's just a copy and paste of the player character model used as a generic knight in an NPC style fight. And again, all that being said, the Midra fight is really good, and just like I've said with a lot of these fights, should be a mini-boss with an ascending level of difficulty with different abilities, which would really fucking fill out the abyssal woods. And the cherry on top of the disappointment that is the overall presence of Midra in this world is the fact that his manse is essentially just a minor dungeon. Like, just think, if you were to reskin this area as catacombs, or use the same generic copy and pasted architecture of a mine's cave walls or any of the other minor dungeons, then what you're essentially looking at is a small looping path with some items to get in optional areas and a lever to pull, eventually leading you to the boss. It is one for one a minor dungeon. There's no mini boss, there's no branching interconnected pathways, there's no NPCs inside, no secrets to uncover. It's just a minor dungeon with a mini-boss fight at the end. And a really good mini-boss, keep that in mind. Now at this point, I became Midra, and figured again I would kind of cheat here by using some sort of frenzied spell, even though I don't think I would have the stats to use Midra's spell itself. So instead, I used the Frenzied Grab. Again, call me a bitch in the comments if you want. I fucking hate Gideon. I'll flex on him in any way I possibly can. And this next matchup, let me tell you, this is the best matchup I had in the entire run. I cannot describe how satisfying it is to just fucking bebop this asshole around. This Ash of War was so good at grabbing him. And I don't know if you could just spam it over and over and cheese Gideon entirely, so I alternated between the spell and the Ash of War, and it seemed to work really fucking well. You know what? I'm taking every negative thing I said about Midra back. He's perfect. He's the greatest fight ever. Specifically because he gives you this item. Specifically because he fucks Gideon in his fat, stupid asshole. 10 out of 10. Perfect fight. Perfect boss. Perfect lore. Perfect minor dungeon. He's great. And with that, I then have to become Gideon. And to do that, I figured I would lean on the fact that he does spells, and just use his weapon like he does to proc the Ash of War debuff that increases the amount of magic and holy damage taken by the target and yourself. And considering that that also buffs holy damage, I figured this would be a perfect time to go up against the Putrid Knight, another boss that I kind of forget about a lot of the time. I don't know if Triple Rings is a spell in the game, but I figured I would just mimic that by using the ring spell that you get on your way to Putrid Knight, which is a really fucking good spell, especially when used here. And there's not really much I have to say about Putrescent. It's fine, I don't know. Like I said, it seems like it should kind of be just a horse fight, a field boss in the world several times. I don't particularly like fighting this boss. I feel like it's not very dancey at all. His moves are kind of awkward to fight at close range, which is why it was great to play as Gideon here and be able to use the range to more effectively deal damage on him. In a way, his Phase 2 moves kind of remind me of like Dragon Fire moves, the way that they're kind of sloppy and seem to have a degree of randomness to the way they find their way towards you, which again might hint to the fact that it's kind of meant to be a field boss. I don't know. Really, the greater disappointment is that this is the only area that you really go underground in the DLC. It almost seems like this should be an entrance to a much larger Safria River kind of area, Nokron, or at least have multiple points in the DLC that lead to an underground. Either way, kind of just a forgettable fight that I don't really enjoy fighting, so I don't really have the need to ever come down here. Anyway, after becoming him, I decided to fight 2 fights in a row instead of doing a swap, which was just to set up a more thematic chain of fights later on. And so I beat Loretta with a pretty easy matchup of ice attack damage on her, which chewed through her pretty good. And then eventually I made my way to Malenia. Another fight that was pretty unremarkable, except for one moment where I just so happened to be attempting to roleplay as the character with just the sword, and I used the Ash of War on her, which hits multiple times quickly, but locks you into an animation, unfortunately for me, just before she triggered her waterfowl attack. But, luckily, was the perfect timing for me to hit a frostbite and knock her out of the move. I don't know whose nuts I licked to get that much karma from the RNG gods, but I'll fucking take it. After that, I became Malenia for the sake of the thematic matchup of Malenia and her brother Messmer. Again, this was a pretty easy matchup. The blood loss on Malenia's katana kind of made for a simple, quick fight, and that's kind of the problem I have with Messmer. He is such a good fight, but because of his place in the mid-game of the DLC, and being a mandatory roadblock before you can get to Inner Ilum, Messmer is kind of made to be underpowered for what he should be based on his moveset. Like, he is my favorite boss fight in all of the DLC, and could very closely be my favorite fight in Elden Ring. I just absolutely hands down wish that he had a full health bar like Malenia, and then maybe to mirror her had like an 80% health bar for his Abyssal Serpent form after he gouges his eyeball out. Would also be cool if, for whatever reason, activating his Abyssal Serpent sent you into an abyss like the Four Kings arena. But yeah, that all aside, it's still a very good fight, and like Morgott, has the potential to be an even better fight if it was positioned at an optional, more endgame area, with appropriate changes to his health and damage. Like, I remember seeing a TikTok where a streamer first tried Messmer, and I can't imagine how disappointing his run of the DLC must have been. Like, imagine one of, like, 2 great bosses in the DLC, and you get to spend, like, what, 3 minutes with him in total? And then you spend, what, like 3 hours on the fucking Radahn Prime fight? I'd be pissed. Anyway, now after becoming Messmer, I decided to fight Godfrey, mostly just to set up the final confrontation of the DLC part of this run between Radahn and Radahn Mikola. And I was hoping that I would be able to find some sort of way of dealing an appropriate amount of damage with his throwable weapon in between the event moves of Godfrey, such as his giant axe slice, which I usually deal with distance and would make a perfect opening for a throwable weapon attack. And this gives me the opportunity to talk about the throwable weapons, which kind of also relates to Rellana's weapon as well. The way it integrates a reliable and easy to trigger ranged attack into its moveset seamlessly. And that's that a lot of these DLC weapons have some sort of aspect to them that allows this greater idea of the combat being ranged and melee at once. And I for one think that this is a really good idea, but only if the game were to take advantage of the fact that these weapons exist and offer unique combat options to implement in unique ways that actually take advantage of the system. I think that the free-form nature of these throwable weapons kind of leaves them in this space where they're either completely useless or completely overpowered. They're in this position where they're a free projectile, something that has never really been done before as far as I'm aware. It's always been before that a weapon will either lose its durability because of its ranged attacks, or it will consume FP, or it will be a bow and arrow and cost the arrow, or it'll be a spell and also cost FP. But in these instances, the throwable weapons are completely free to you, and so they have to be balanced in another way, which is usually that they just don't deal enough damage with their throw attack or consume too much stamina to be viable. And that's really kind of sad, because it's essentially giving us the option for throwable combat without actually giving us a viable throwable combat. In a perfect world, however, the entire game would be reorganized or revamped so that these throwable weapons have a place in the combat sandbox. But along that same line of thought, if every boss fight has some aspect to it where throwable weapons are useful, it would be kind of silly to cater to one weapon type. And so the reality is, if you want to implement this as a system, all weapons should have some sort of throwable or ranged aspect, and all bosses should have some sort of interplay between that. It would just be one extra layer to the combat. In my eyes, I envision a way in which, when you activate the throwable charged heavy aspect of a weapon, it should then offer you a reticle of some sort, either just like the bow reticle, or maybe the projected path of trajectory dotted line that some games use, to show you where you're going to land that attack. And in certain instances, on certain moves, there should be a critical marker showing on that boss, in a position where, if you land your throwable attack, you then stagger the boss into a critical, and cancel the attack. I think this would work perfectly in a similar way to the way that we currently use throwable weapons, in the situations where there's going to be an event-style move where your only option is just to make distance anyway, and where currently the throwable weapons see most of their value, filling in for the boredom that takes place between spectacle moves. But what if instead those spectacle moves could otherwise be engaged with, instead of simply avoided? For example, within this footage, what if instead of simply running away from Horlu's giant earth shatter slam, you were to instead charge a heavy attack and hit him in the dome, knocking him onto a backstep and allowing a critical? This would offer an interesting engagement moment because you would essentially have to face down this move and have the confidence that you're going to land the attack and the accuracy to land that attack, otherwise you'll be hit by the move. And if you were to otherwise land the attack, then you would be close enough to trigger the critical before Horlu could stand back up. This could apply to a lot of different boss fights, like I always clown on Placidusax's lightning stake for being kind of boring. But what if instead you were to throw your weapon into his lightning stake and explode it in his hand, blasting him onto the ground? Would be a lot more interesting and engaging than just watching a cool explosion, especially so if you knew that the explosion was coming and instead could flip the tables on him. I don't know, again, this is just kind of like me throwing something out there. The entire game should be based around these weapons if you were to integrate them at all, in the same way that Bloodborne's gun parries were an innovation to the Souls formula as a whole, and basically every fight in that game outside of giant beast fights take advantage of the gun parry because of it, and every player is given a gun to use. So I don't know, it just kind of sucks that these throwable weapons are wasted. Again, the DLC has cool assets, cool ideas. They just end up wasted time and time again. Throwable weapons are nothing but a gimmick and a way to kill baby ads from far, I guess. They're fun. I just wish they were interesting and fun. Anyway, back to the challenge run. After a long and hard fought battle with, I believe, a +2 messmer spear, because I was running low on 3s and 4s, so had to play this one by ear. And knowing that I'm pretty good at Horlu, I figured I could take him out. I eventually became him, and made my way to another forgettable boss fight from the DLC that I kind of just needed to get out of the way. Metyr the Finger whatever, which I guess you could say is a thematic fight, being that it was Godfrey pounding a god, which we all know he was pretty good at doing. Wink wink, America. And I leveled my weapon fully for this because I fucking hate this fight. I think most people know that this fight feels like shit and has no sort of rhythm to it, especially when the attacks have different hitboxes depending on the body or the attacking limb itself, or the fingers coming crawling to you. It just all feels like this mess of damage that you don't want to be anywhere near. And I kind of wish I would have saved a spell-based caster build for this fight, but I was able to overcome it with pure fat damage and a stagger critical, and overall wasn't that hard. But yeah, this fight is still not worth doing. It's still a pain in the ass to get to. Overall, just kind of sucks. And I figured while doing this fight, I might as well take on Count Ymir, the embarrassing finger guy fight, which I crushed pretty easily to gain access to his fit, so I could roleplay a little harder when I became the finger god, by grabbing the finger hammer as the remembrance weapon, and using it to fuck the shit out of Radahn, and then deal considerably less damage on Elden Beast. This weapon has a really powerful charged heavy attack, so bebopping your way through Radahnn's event moves is a pretty straightforward process, and it's kind of a shame that this weapon is pretty fun, because I really don't want to have to fight Metyr to get it every time. This fight was the first time I ever got the chance to summon Torrent in this boss battle. And let me tell you, it is such a nice change, and kind of makes me wonder if he was always able to be summoned here and no one ever tried it. Like, imagine if FromSoft was like, these fucking idiots aren't fighting the fight right, so let's just add it into the patch notes and pretend like it's something new so they'll get a fucking clue. Because really it just seems like you should be able to take your best buddy, your trustworthy mount that's been with you through the worst this world has to offer, carried you through poison swamps and everything else. It's really nice to have him by your side in the final fight, and really makes stuff like the Elden stars and the jumping over the rings a lot more satisfying and straightforward. And after a considerably long fight with the Elden Beast, I finally brought him down, and was then able to choose if I wanted to be the Elden Beast itself, or Radahn, which I ultimately chose to be, for the thematic matchup between Radahn and his sons. Radahn Prime. What could I possibly say about Radahn Prime at this point that I haven't already? He's a joke, I don't know. It's just so sad to see such an important fight have so many basic failings that so many people are willing to completely overlook, just like blinded by the grandiose nature of this fight. This fight is the epitome of that Family Guy Godfather joke. It literally insists upon itself. It implies it's this hard fight. It implies it's this important fight. But in practice, it's phoned in garbage with copy and paste nonsense everywhere. It's like the equivalent of Marvel references in a boss fight. Ooh, look, Bloodflame from Mohg. Ooh, look, Starscourge Radahn's base moveset reworked into a standing position. The Meteor Strike move? Yeah, we'll do that again too, fuck it. Except this time it has like no impact because it's not a giant battlefield, we know it's coming, and there's a shitload of architecture around that he should have knocked into. And of course, the Meteor Strike wasn't enough. They had to add arbitrary fucking holy light projectiles alongside it. And of course, he hits the fucking anime after image multi-strike attacks. Like, it's all so cheesy and fucking lame. And if there's one thing I stand by in my entire Shadow of the Erdtree video, because it's one of the reasons I decided to make that entire video, was when I said that I first thought this to be a modded joke DLC fight. Like someone was pranking the internet. Oh, look at these leaks. The DLC's gonna have Radahn. Oh, wow. When in reality, it was some mod someone made a year and a half ago. I think the worst thing that I can say about Radahn is the fact that he was patched. And not patched to adjust values, and not patched to fix a visual error or adjust a status effect or anything of that nature. He was patched because he was broken on a fundamental level from the ground up. A basic melee attack that didn't have room to be dodged. That is such a fucking joke, and I'm still pissed about it. And patching it was an acknowledgement that it was broken, which is something I can kind of argue for Waterfowl, in that one change a long time ago was made, in my eyes, specifically to make Waterfowl more fair towards the player. And that was a patch that increased the player's roll distance while they were on light rolling, which to me was the developers acknowledging that the spin move was their canonical answer to the move found by the community, and therefore gave you extra leeway to complete it by giving you extra distance you could roll with it. And this is very subtle, so you could make an argument that it was just in general a patch to the game to make the game better. You could argue a lot of things, but you can in no way argue that about Radahn. He was broken, and they fixed him. And even after being fixed, he's just not that good of a fight. He was difficult because he was broken, and now he's difficult because underneath that broken nature, he was just a poorly designed fight that no one could recognize was poorly designed because they were so swept up in the ideal that he was difficult. He has no back punishes and attacks you blindly, and that makes him feel so much more just like a piece of code, an NPC, than something like Morgott, who attacks with his tail when you're behind him. And no, I'm not saying he should be made easier by, I don't know, having actual telegraphs that aren't completely obscured by hair. You could just as easily make his back punish a punish, as in a move you have to dodge, maybe with an audio cue to signify it's coming, since the visual telegraph will be obscured, which then turns into a move by his basic moveset, increasing the amount of moves you have to dodge before an opening by however many. It would absolutely count as being more difficult when adjusted for being fair towards the player. Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of sick of shitting on this guy. And that kind of leads me to my final point. Wrapping all of this up, all of the opinions I've gathered about this DLC, which mostly has just been the same opinions I had last year, because I believe my opinions stood the test of time. This DLC is just not worth playing that much. I don't want to go out of my way to play it. It's just too bad, and it's just too hard to get to. And that sucks. And that brings me to my final point. I know how to fix this mess. And I know I'm gonna sound like a fucking idiot, so stick with me, because after I explain it all, I guarantee you it makes sense, even if it is just the ramblings of a delusional, perpetually online weirdo. FromSoft needs to take the DLC and turn it into a sequel. And I know what that sounds like. I know that sounds like the most anti-consumer thing I could have ever said in my life. Yeah, sell us the stuff we already have again. Ooh, please, take more of my money after you disappointed me. I get that, but hear me out. The entirety of this content is disappointing, and I think FromSoft knows that. Miyazaki has apologized that the DLC took 2 years to come out, which absolutely is not necessary whatsoever, if it was a DLC that was worth the 2 years. I had not even considered that this content would be bad until I played it, and I would have been perfectly fine with it taking 3, 4, 5, however long, so long as it was the incredible content that I had come to expect. And so what I need from FromSoft is for them to acknowledge that fact, that this was disappointing, and to say that they're going to make up for it, if they want a path forward, and not to just sell us garbage from now on, like Night Rain and that new one, whatever it's called. So step 1, FromSoft needs to acknowledge that their DLC disappointed, and then they need to take this content and make a fully fledged Elden Ring sequel. And how do they do that? Well, by retconning a lot of stuff. And that starts from the very beginning. And this is the idea I have to make up for that. FromSoft drops a trailer where the Tarnished is exiting the cocoon of the Empyrean. They're taking their hand off of Miquella's hand. At which point, Needle Knight Leda says from behind them, "You saw it, didn't you? Saint Trina's nightmare. The visions of the future." Something along those lines, which then tells us that this wasn't a one-for-one reality that was happening before us. This content was a sneak peek as to the full Lands of Shadow, and that this content was only the stuff that Saint Trina cared about. One thing I've kind of been pointing out throughout this is that there's really only one thing going on in the Lands of Shadow, and that's Miquella's plotline. When you look at Rellana, she's just sitting there. When you look at Midra, he's just sitting there. When you look at Romina, she's just sitting there. They have nothing in this world to do because the only thing we can care about is Miquella. There is all of like 2 NPCs that have quests that go outside of the straight line towards Miquella. Egon for Bayle and the poison perfumer guy for Saint Trina. Everyone else is just scrambling to make this mad dash towards Miquella, and it makes this whole giant DLC feel like it's essentially a straight path that you're just following. If we compare that to the base game, the amount of players in that world with their own motivations and thoughts and conspiracies for power and ideas of how they should change the world, it's absurd. Ranni and her entire plot. The Dung Eater has a fucking ending. Fia, Goldmask, even the bosses themselves all seem to have motivations beyond just power. And yet, the Lands of Shadow, there is one thing. It's Miquella, and everything else has to be peripheral. But if we were to explain all of that away as Saint Trina having a prophetic dream that only relates to the things she cares about, then the real Lands of Shadow we visit in the sequel, made up of the assets taken that were wasted in the DLC, and revamped to be a new, full, standalone project, you could make something so much better than the sum of its parts. From a sandbox level, you could make the world worth exploring, because like I said, you wouldn't need the Scadutree fragments. You would instead spawn as a level 1, and explore the world for various everything, just like the base game. The throwable weapons could be the new meta. Every weapon could be throwable or have some sort of intrinsic projectile property, like I said. The bosses could be revamped to take advantage of that. The bad, boring bosses could serve as mini-bosses to fill out the world and make it fun and new, while new, important, well-designed bosses could replace them and flesh out the world in ways that don't just relate to Miquella. Messmer could be made an optional boss that has way more health and is much closer to a Malenia-style optional fight. Radahn and Metyr can be fucking deleted and tried again, and we could finally have some closure when it comes to Melina and Godwyn. Melina could have had her mind wiped by dying and returning to the Land of Shadow, where she returns to the state of the Glow-Eyed Queen, which would run in tandem with the Frenzied Flame ending where she just does that anyway, without dying. And there's infinite potential for a Godwyn boss. Could be anything. The bottom line is, this wasn't good enough, and if FromSoft wants to move forward, I think they have to move backwards and repair the damage they've done. If you ask me, this DLC was really insulting. It was phoned in. It was an insult to Elden Ring fans, who wanted more Elden Ring content more than any other game they could possibly ever want. I really don't fucking give a shit about Night Rain, and the other one just sounds like Night Rain but on Switch, I guess. And that's the thing that FromSoft really has to gain here. Publicity. They're not going to be able to survive off of the goodwill they've built up thus far for long. I think many people already see the smoke on the horizon. And so with that notion of repairing and maintaining the goodwill of FromSoft, I offer this as one final piece that fills in the rest and makes this go from a shitty idea that's pretty consumer toxic to a good idea that will restore my faith in FromSoft. And that is, this sequel should cost $40 less to anyone who played Shadow of the Erdtree. And I don't know if that could be a logistical nightmare or have some sort of exploit, but that would be fair to me. And a good idea. The amount of goodwill it would generate would be far more valuable than any lost profits. And let me just run the numbers for you to confirm that. Elden Ring sold 25 million copies. It recently became 30 million, but let's just go with 25 because that was a stat for a long time. 25 million copies. And its DLC was celebrated for selling 5 million. And I don't know if that's out of touch or if DLCs just really sell bad in general, but that is a significant decrease and a significant lack of retention from your audience. The hype just wasn't there. The obvious thing to point out, though, is that a sequel would likely retain a large portion of the audience that was developed within Elden Ring 1. And even if you took the DLC as a base template and then took 2 more years or longer to work on it, to create a sequel, the number of sales would far outmatch multiple times over the amount of money that was made on the DLC. You could sell half as many copies of the sequel as the original, and refund every player who played Shadow of the Erdtree, and you would still make more money per square inch of work put into the game. I don't see why they wouldn't do this. FromSoft in this current state seems to love reusing content, with their latest reveal of Night Rain, which is out by now, but I made this a lot earlier. Latest reveal having costumes of characters from their older games as skins for the playable characters in Night Rain. That on top of the entire game just being a copy and paste game. And if a full Elden Ring sequel was too much effort, well then you've got an entire DLC of assets just waiting to be reused properly this time that everyone could benefit from. If you ask me, this is the ultimate win-win situation. Elden Ring fans get more Elden Ring. People who played Shadow of the Erdtree and were disappointed get a refund. FromSoft gets to reuse content and ultimately build toward a product that will definitely sell better than Shadow of the Erdtree. I can basically guarantee that. And the vast amount of players who didn't play Shadow of the Erdtree, it would all be new to them anyway. You would be revitalizing a large part of the community that missed out on that content in the first place. And you get to fill in the holes lore-wise with the stuff that got left on the cutting room floor, such as Malenia, one of the favorite characters in the entire game, and Godwyn, the perpetually wasted character. So yeah, I don't know. When I put all together, it really seems like that is the way forward. That's my idea. And it's hard to really conceptualize, because if I just say, sell us the content again, everyone would think I was crazy. And so I really needed to go over everything before I could put this out there as a concept. So let me know if you agree with me. I don't know. Because if there's one thing you should take away from my criticism of Shadow of the Erdtree, it's not that I think that any one thing is particularly bad, except Radahn. Radahn is pretty fucking bad. Hard to get over that. But he doesn't sink the entire DLC. The one thing that does is that for every single thing that's done right, there's about 10 things that fail to live up to their own potential. 10 things that are good ideas but are wasted, or are good assets but are wasted. The implementation is just fucking terrible. Amateur hour shit. I wouldn't even really go as far as to say that the DLC was bad. It's just really distracting to know how much better it could have been. And I guess that's why I'm saying it is bad. I can't just ignore that distraction. Everything building up to Shadow of the Erdtree would imply that it was going to be this incredibly carefully designed, perfect experience. They took 2 years to make it, and reused a bunch of stuff from the original game. They had a huge head start, and then failed because they got too distracted with trying to make new things, and then half-assing those things so that they don't really even have a place in this world. Arguably because this had to be a DLC. I don't think they could justify putting any more effort into it while still making it a DLC, and that left some huge gaps that needed to be filled. And so I would say a good majority of the problems I have with this content, the glaring issues, kind of all fade away when you just take this content and turn it into a sequel. When you flesh out all the paper-thin aspects. When you give time and resources to flesh out all the other narratives that went by the wayside to develop Miquella's story. When you design an entire game with a set of weapons that fit the new things you want to do with them, and design a myriad of bosses that take advantage of those weapons. Above all else, it is just a huge shame to see all of these pretty decent assets come together to make a subpar product. And above all else, I just want FromSoft to be given the chance to cook again. Yes, this feels like a betrayal, but that does set the stage for them to make it right eventually. Unfortunately, with Night Rain and dusk, blood, whatever on the horizon, I just can't see a big comeback coming anytime soon. We can assume that the next 2 years are basically going to be devoid of any good FromSoft content. So I don't know if people are going to be pissed off at me for saying this. I want them to make a sequel. And the easiest way to pitch that idea to them is to say, you have a giant DLC head start to make a sequel. And I think the biggest hurdle would be to get people on board with that. And the easiest way to go about that, in my opinion, is just to make up for it financially. To show that your company isn't just a profit-forward company and actually cares about its community and wants to make up for disappointing content that failed to meet basic standards we've come to expect. And I've said before, as long as the content's good, I really don't care about paying more for it or waiting longer for it. Elden Ring cost, I think, $60, maybe 70, and it's a game I've played like 100+ times. I absolutely got my money worth. But from that same line of thought, that has to apply from the other way as well, for the fan and company dynamic to play out in a satisfying, non-toxic way. When we get cheated out of the content we've come to expect, the quality of content we've come to expect, then you have to either expect that you're going to lose fans, or you're going to have to make up for it in a way that allows you to retain those fans. And by essentially refunding Shadow of the Erdtree, I do think that would show a great degree of commitment to this community that they've developed over the last decade. And it would certainly restore my faith in FromSoft, even despite my discontent in the subsequent entries in their catalog of games. Anyway, to finish off the run, I took Radahn and used Rykard as a wild card. I had already used Radahn's weapon, just not the weird DLC version of it. And so I used the Serpent Hunter Spear, then became Rykard, took on Placiduous Axe. Then, honestly, I forgot to do the deer at this point, so I caught up on that one. I became the deer and took on Estelle, took Estelle's weapon into the Lich Dragon fight, and finally was left up with a matchup of the Lich Dragon, which just has dragon spells, and the last easy fight in the game, taking on Godric with some pretty terrible dragon spells. And that was the run, and in hindsight, yeah, I don't think the DLC meshes well with this challenge. In fact, it kind of just highlights just how much effort it took to set this challenge up. Just to make it an even playing field, I had to collect so many items in the base game, design my run around getting to the DLC early, and then collect so many more items in the DLC that it kind of just loses the value of the concept. It's such a plateau from that point. And while there was some interesting moments within the different matchups I made, I don't know if I would recommend this run in totality. It might be interesting to approach it from the end game, starting after defeating every single boss in the base game, and then make your matchups exclusively between the DLC fights, but again, I don't know. It's just so awkward to transition to this DLC. And again, I kind of just wish it was standalone, which would be perfect for a sequel scenario. So that's my analysis. That was the run. I know I repeated a lot of stuff. I apologize. It all kind of had to be said again. And also I was kind of just filling time to show off some of the boss fights that I did and show off how long and grueling a lot of them were with the less leveled weapons. Anyway, despite all that garbage, I hope you still enjoyed, and hopefully I'll catch you soon in some Night Rain content when I change my mind and decide to buy it. Anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you next time.